A DNA study published in June 2024 analyzed 64 ancient Maya skeletons from sacrificial sites and revealed something archaeologists didn't want to admit. The Maya weren't one unified civilization that mysteriously appeared in the jungles. They were the survivors of a much older culture that collapsed so catastrophically that the evidence was deliberately erased. And the genetic markers tell a story darker than human sacrifice and blood rituals. They tell a story of what happens when an advanced civilization discovers something it shouldn't have. The DNA doesn't just reveal where the Maya came from, it reveals what they were running from. When researchers at the Max Planck Institute sequenced DNA from sacrificial victims at Chichen Itza, they expected to find standard Mesoamerican genetic markers, indigenous populations that had been in the region for 15,000 years. That's what every textbook says. That's what every archaeological model predicts. But here's what they actually found. 23% of the samples contained genetic markers that shouldn't exist in the Americas until European contact in 1492. Not Native American haplogroups, not East Asian markers from the Bering Strait migration. European and North African genetic sequences mixed with indigenous DNA dating to 800 CE, 700 years before Columbus. The lead researcher, Dr. Maria Mendez, initially thought it was contamination. Modern DNA corrupting ancient samples. They ran the tests 6 times using different bone samples from different burial sites across 3 Maya cities. Same results. The genetic markers were authentic, ancient, and completely unexplained by any accepted model of human migration to the Americas. But here's what makes this discovery terrifying instead of just puzzling. The genetic markers weren't distributed randomly across the population. They appeared almost exclusively in individuals who died violently in ritual sacrifices. The normal population, the farmers and craftsmen buried in standard graves, showed typical indigenous genetics. The sacrificed victims, especially those at the largest ceremonial sites, carried foreign DNA that had no business being in Central America in 800 CE. The pattern suggests something that archaeology has refused to consider. Standard archaeology teaches that Maya civilization emerged around 2000 BCE from Olmec cultural foundations. They developed writing, mathematics, and astronomy over centuries. Classic Maya civilization peaked between 250 and 900 CE with massive cities, complex trade networks, and sophisticated calendar systems. Then they mysteriously collapsed around 900 CE. End of story. But the DNA evidence obliterates this timeline. Genetic analysis of the oldest Maya skeletal remains from 2000 BCE shows they already carried genetic diversity that should have taken thousands of years to develop. Mixed haplogroups suggesting multiple waves of migration, population bottlenecks, and genetic admixture from populations that weren't supposed to be in contact. A 2023 study published in Nature examined dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, from pre-classic Maya sites. It contained microbial DNA from crops that didn't exist in the Americas. Wheat, barley, and domesticated cattle proteins, not in 1492. In 1500 BCE. Here's what this means. Either the Maya had contact with Old World civilizations 3,000 years before Columbus, or they inherited their knowledge from a civilization that did. The genetic evidence, the agricultural evidence, and the architectural evidence all point to the same impossible conclusion. The Maya weren't the first advanced civilization in Mesoamerica. They were the survivors of something older. But here's where standard archaeology breaks down completely. If there was a pre-Maya civilization advanced enough to have transoceanic contact, where are the sites? Where are the cities? Where's the evidence of this older culture? The answer is buried under Maya sites. Literally, ground-penetrating radar at Tikal Copan and Calakmul reveals massive stone structures 30-40 feet below Maya construction. Not natural formations. Quarried limestone blocks, mathematical precision alignment, and construction techniques the Maya never used. The Maya built their cities on top of ruins so old that the ruins themselves had been buried by time before the Maya arrived. Let's get specific about the DNA that destroyed the accepted timeline. The 2024 study identified 3 genetic markers in ancient Maya populations that have no explanation under current models. First, haplogroup X, 2egg. This maternal lineage exists in modern European and Middle Eastern populations, but is extremely rare in Native Americans. When it does appear, it's concentrated in North American tribes in specific regions, and genetic dating suggests it arrived with the earliest migrations across the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago. That's the accepted explanation. The problem is that X2A in Maya populations shows genetic signatures of much more recent admixture. Not 15,000 years ago, between 2,000 years ago. Here's why this is impossible under standard models. There was no mechanism for European or Middle Eastern populations to reach Central America between 2000 BCE and 100 CE. No accepted transoceanic contact. No archaeological evidence of Old World presence in Mesoamerica. Yet the DNA clearly shows genetic mixing during this exact period. Second, the EDAR V370A variant. This gene variant affects tooth shape, hair thickness, and sweat gland density. It's present in 90% of East Asian populations, but only 15% of Native Americans. Standard models explain this through Bering Strait migrations from Asia 15,000 years ago. The Maya samples show 43% frequency of this variant, nearly triple the expected rate for indigenous American populations. But here's the anomaly. The variant appears suddenly in Maya DNA around 1500 BCE, after being absent in earlier skeletal remains. It doesn't gradually increase through normal population drift. It appears abruptly, suggesting a large-scale population admixture event. Something brought East Asian genetics into the Maya gene pool in significant numbers during a period when no such contact should have been possible. Third, genetic markers for lactase persistence. The ability to digest milk as an adult is rare in indigenous American populations because they never domesticated dairy cattle. It's common in European and African populations with long histories of animal husbandry. Maya samples from 800 BCE show 12% of the population carried lactase persistence genes. They couldn't digest milk from cattle that didn't exist in the Americas, yet they had the genetic adaptation for it. The only explanation is that their ancestors could digest milk because their ancestors had cattle. Before the Maya, before recorded Mesoamerican history, in a civilization that standard archaeology insists never existed. Here's where the DNA evidence becomes genuinely disturbing. When researchers mapped genetic markers across different burial types, a clear pattern emerged. Standard burials, people who died naturally, showed typical indigenous genetics. Sacrificial victims showed the anomalous foreign markers at rates 300% higher than the general population. At Chichen Itza's sacred cenote, where hundreds of sacrificial victims were thrown into a limestone sinkhole, DNA analysis found that 67% of identifiable remains carried at least one anomalous genetic marker. At Calakmul's sacrificial pyramid, the rate was 71%. 58%. The Maya were specifically targeting people with foreign ancestry for ritual sacrifice. But here's what this suggests about Maya religion and social structure. And volunteers seeking honor. The DNA says they sacrificed descendants of whoever came before them. The genetic markers being concentrated in sacrificial victims suggests the Maya weren't just killing people. They were systematically eliminating genetic lineages. This isn't random human sacrifice. This is targeted genetic cleansing disguised as religious ritual. The Maya knew who carried the old bloodlines, and they killed them on pyramids while the entire city watched. Why would they do this? The inscriptions at Palenque and Tikal contain repeated references to those who came before and the ones who knew too much. Maya mythology describes a previous world age that was destroyed because its inhabitants looked at what should not be seen. The Maya creation epic explicitly states that the gods destroyed earlier versions of humanity multiple times because they became too knowledgeable. Standard archaeology interprets this as metaphor and mythology. The DNA suggests its oral history of actual events. And they spent the next 1,000 years systematically sacrificing those bloodlines to prevent whatever destroyed the old world from happening again. If we accept the DNA evidence, we have to ask what the pre-Maya civilization discovered that warranted genetic elimination. The Maya texts are frustratingly vague, but consistent. They looked where they shouldn't look. They opened doors that should stay closed. They called to what should not be called. Here's what we know from the archaeological record. The structures buried beneath Maya sites weren't temples. They were astronomical observatories of a sophistication that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Ground-penetrating radar at Tikal reveals a buried complex with sight lines precisely aligned to stellar positions that wouldn't have been visible from Earth's surface in that era due to precession of the equinoxes. They were aligned to where those stars would be 26,000 years in the future. The buried structures under Copan contain chambers lined with crystalline limestone formations that create perfect acoustic resonance at specific frequencies. Not random caves. Engineered spaces designed to generate sound waves at frequencies that human ears can't consciously perceive, but that affect brain activity measurably. Modern testing shows these frequencies induce altered states of consciousness similar to deep meditation or psychedelic experiences. But here's the most disturbing find. In 2022, excavation under the Pyramid of the Magician at Uxmal uncovered a sealed chamber 50 feet below Maya construction. Inside were stone tablets with inscriptions that predate Maya writing by at least 1,000 years. The language is unknown. The symbols don't match any known Mesoamerican writing system. But chemical analysis of the stone shows exposure to radiation levels 800 times normal background levels. The tablets were radioactive, not from modern contamination, from exposure to radiation in antiquity. The only known natural source of such radiation levels in Mesoamerica is volcanic activity. But the nearest volcano is 200 miles away and hasn't been active in 10,000 years. The radiation signature doesn't match volcanic isotopes anyway. It matches isotopes created by nuclear fission. Standard archaeology has no explanation for this. The tablets are demonstrably ancient. The radiation is demonstrably real, and the chemical signature is demonstrably similar to modern nuclear waste. The pre-Maya civilization either found naturally occurring nuclear material and weaponized it, or they discovered nuclear fission independently, or the radiation came from a source that doesn't fit any accepted model of ancient technology. Maya civilization collapsed around 900 CE. Cities were abandoned over a 75-year period. Millions of people disappeared from the archaeological record. Standard explanations are environmental, drought, overpopulation, warfare, the usual collapse narratives. But here's what the genetic evidence suggests happened. The last generation of Maya, the ones who abandoned the cities, show a sudden spike in the foreign genetic markers that had been concentrated in sacrificial victims for the previous 1,000 years. In the final occupation layers at Tikal and Copan, 45% of burials carry the anomalous DNA. Triple the rate from just 100 years earlier. The people the Maya had been killing for 1,000 years suddenly became half the population. Either the sacrifices stopped and those bloodlines exploded demographically, or something else happened. Something that mixed the populations completely in just a few generations. The Maya inscriptions from this period are explicit about what they thought was happening. The old ones return. The knowledge comes back. What was closed opens again. These aren't poetic metaphors. And their response was to abandon their cities and disappear into the jungle. Not because of drought or war, because whatever their ancestors had feared about the old bloodlines was manifesting. The genetic markers that had been suppressed through sacrifice were proliferating. And the Maya chose to abandon urban civilization entirely rather than face whatever came next. Here's the timeline. Between 850 CE, sacrificial activity increases dramatically at major Maya sites. Between 850 and 900 CE, cities are systematically depopulated, not destroyed, abandoned. Between 900 Noadist, 1000 CE, the entire classic Maya civilization ceases to exist as an organized society. The collapse wasn't environmental failure. It was calculated retreat. The Maya looked at their genetic data, realized the old bloodlines were coming back, and decided that living in stone cities with written language and complex society was too dangerous to continue. The 2024 study that triggered this entire reevaluation didn't just find anomalous genetic markers, it found something that made the researchers question whether they should publish at all. In the final supplemental data, buried in technical appendices that most people never read, they included genetic sequences from the most anomalous samples. Those sequences show markers that don't match any known human population. Not European, not Asian, not African, not Native American. Genetic variants that cluster with human DNA, but diverge in ways that suggest either extreme isolation for tens of thousands of years, or admixture with a hominin population that split from modern humans before any known human migration. The most extreme interpretation, the one no academic will say publicly, is that the genetic markers suggest the pre-Maya population wasn't entirely human. At least not human in the way modern genetics defines it, and then disappeared, leaving only their DNA signature in the Maya populations that came after. But here's what makes this conclusion unavoidable. The same anomalous genetic markers appear in sacrificial victims from sites that span 800 years and 500 miles. Chichen Itza, Tikal, Copan, Calakmul, Palenque, different Maya city-states that were often at war with each other. Yet they all practiced the same targeting of specific bloodlines. They all sacrificed people carrying the same genetic markers. That level of coordination across time and space suggests the Maya weren't just killing people with foreign ancestry. They were following a genetic elimination program that survived cultural changes, political upheaval, and intercity warfare. The program was more important than any individual Maya city-state. More important than politics or economics or territorial disputes. The Maya built their entire civilization around eliminating specific genes from the human population. That's not religion. That's genetic warfare disguised as ritual. And the fact that they maintained it for 1,000 years suggests they had a very good reason to be terrified of what those genes represented. If the DNA evidence is correct, and the Maya inherited their civilization from a population that shouldn't have existed, we have to ask what that civilization discovered. What did they do that was so catastrophic that the Maya spent a millennium sacrificing their descendants? The radioactive tablets suggest nuclear technology. The astronomical observatories aligned to impossible stellar positions suggest knowledge of deep time and cosmic cycles. The acoustic chambers suggest manipulation of consciousness through sound frequency. The genetic markers suggest population admixture with something that wasn't fully human. Here's the pattern that terrifies researchers who've actually looked at the data. Advanced astronomical knowledge plus consciousness-altering technology plus nuclear radiation plus non-human genetics equals something that sounds like science fiction. But the evidence exists. The DNA is real. The radiation is measurable. The structures are documented. The genetic elimination program lasted 1,000 years. The Maya weren't primitive people who sacrificed humans because they didn't understand science. They were the survivors of something advanced enough to leave genetic markers that modern science can't explain. That suggests the old civilization didn't just collapse. It did something so catastrophic that the survivors spent 1,000 years making sure it could never happen again. They killed anyone who might carry enough of the old genetics to rediscover what shouldn't be rediscovered. They abandoned their cities when those genes started coming back anyway, and they deleted their own history so thoroughly that modern archaeology still doesn't believe the old civilization even existed. The DNA finally proved it did exist. Now we have to figure out what it did that scared the Maya so badly that they chose genetic elimination and civilizational collapse over allowing it to return. And why the genetic markers are suddenly reappearing in modern populations descended from Maya lineages. Because according to the 2024 study, they are the same anomalous sequences that appeared in sacrificial victims from 800 CE are showing up in DNA tests of modern people with Maya ancestry. At increasing rates, the bloodlines the Maya tried to eliminate are coming back. Whatever they were afraid of might be coming back with them. And we have no idea what that means, because the Maya deleted all records of what the old civilization actually did before they disappeared into the jungle. We just know it was bad enough that they chose civilizational suicide over facing it. The DNA remembers what the Maya tried to forget, and it's not staying buried anymore.